Hello, General Biology, and welcome to Section 1.3, Chapter 1. And if you remember, in an earlier screencast for this chapter, I mentioned that we would be learning about the characteristics of living things. So that's what we're going to see. We've got some key concepts here. What characteristics do all living things share? And we're going to talk about those. We're going to see that there's 8 characteristics altogether. And then living things are made up of basic units called cells, and they are based on a universal genetic code. So these are the 8. They obtain and use materials and energy. They grow and develop. They reproduce, respond to their environment, maintain a stable internal environment, and change over time. So these are the characteristics of the living things, and we're going to talk about each one of them more specifically. So let's start with biology. And I've already told you this, biology is the study of life. That's the definition. Whenever you see ology at the end of a word, it means the study of. So bio means life. So this is the study of life. But we have to ask ourselves, what's life? What makes up life? And there's not just one characteristic that's able to describe a living thing, but there's a combination of characteristics. And we need to be able to separate the living from the non-living. So you might think, okay, a cell is living, but a virus is not. A virus actually exists at a border between organisms and non-living things. So it's not truly living. It does contain a nucleic acid, which contains a genetic code, but by itself, it cannot go through the characteristics. It cannot go through some of the characteristics of living things, while it has others. So let's take a look at my drawing here. And this ship-like looking thing is the virus. And a virus is made up of a protein coat. That's why I have protein written here. And a nucleic acid. And that nucleic acid can be either DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, or RNA, ribonucleic acid, and that's genetics. That's where the genetics is. So a virus, it cannot reproduce on its own. It does not grow and develop. It does not respond to its environment, which those are some of the things that are characteristics of living things. But the way it reproduces is it requires a living cell. And what will happen is this protein will literally attach itself to a living cell and inject this nucleic acid into the cell. And then when the cell gets ready to reproduce, it copies this genetic information and it produces more viruses. So one virus on one cell can produce roughly about 120 new viruses. And then as those new viruses float around and attach to healthy cells, each of those 120 healthy cells will reproduce 120 more viruses. So that's how a virus moves. So despite these difficulties, we can list characteristics that most living things have in common. Both fish and coral, for example, show all of the characteristics common to living things. And I know you don't think coral is living because it's hard as a rock, but it is living, and we're going to look at these characteristics. So one of the very first things that I've already said is living things are based on a universal genetic code, and that genetic code is written in a chemical molecule called DNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid. Do you want me to spell that for you? Deoxyribonucleic acid. This is the master genetic molecule of cells. And it tells you that you're going to have a freckle on the cheek of your face versus a freckle on the cheek of your butt. Literally, that's how specific it is. So this information in DNA, because of its structure, can be copied and passed from parent to offspring, from one generation to the next. And it's similar in many of the organisms on Earth. Chimps are 99% genetically identical to humans. That 1% gives us the ability to think, reason, and be the apex species. DNA, as you can see here, this is the DNA molecule. It's a complex chemical molecule. In Chapter 2, we're going to call it a macromolecule. Macro means large, so it's a giant molecule, and it's made from different chemical compounds that are put together in a certain sequence that we call the DNA alphabet. There's a chemical called adenine that always bonds with a chemical called thymine. And there's a chemical called guanine that always bonds with a chemical called cytosine. And the A, the T, the C, the G, those chemicals are the DNA alphabet, and they determine your characteristics. The way these are put together would tell you whether you're going to have red hair and blue eyes versus brown hair and blue eyes, or green eyes or brown eyes. Okay, so that's DNA, and all living things have some sort of genetic code to them. Another thing is that living things grow and develop. Now, grow means they're going to increase in size. Develop means that they're going to have some changes. So think of a tadpole. There's my little tadpole. Versus a frog. And here you get to see some of my artistic ability again. It's lacking, I will tell you. But this frog's not too bad. Give it a little forked tongue. All right, so there's our frog that we have. And this tadpole is going to grow and develop into this frog. So that's growth and development. So a single fertilized egg will divide again and again until that's growing, increasing in size, and then those cells are going to differentiate. They're going to change. They're going to become specialized. And we're going to have cells that will be muscle cells and nerve cells and digestive cells. And they'll start to have different functions so that that individual takes on a whole different look, a whole different appearance. Another thing is living things respond to their environment. So the environment somehow influences them, and they respond to it in some way. What happens when you get cold? Do you get goosebumps? You're responding to your environment. Those goosebumps are making that area of your skin tighter together so less area is exposed to the cold. So in this case, some sort of stimulus is a signal in which an organism responds. Flowers, you've got sunlight. And I don't know why that keeps making those lines, but you got sunlight, and a flower will grow towards the sunlight. There's my little rendition of a flower. It'll move towards that sunlight, and that is a response. It'll lean towards the sun because it needs that sunlight instead of just growing straight up. Living things reproduce, and that means that they produce new similar organisms. So that's the next characteristic. So they're going to reproduce in some way. We're most familiar with sexual reproduction, where it involves two individuals in order to make the new offspring. And we're familiar with females that give the egg and males give the sperm. And when these two come together, you get a baby from that. And that's sexual reproduction. And many plants and animals do that, but there's also asexual reproduction. And anytime we add an A before this, that means without. So this is without sex. Now you're probably saying, well, wait a minute, Mrs. Saunders, how can you have a child without sex? How can you have a new organism without sex? Have you ever taken a piece of a plant, put it into water, it starts to root, and then you plant that water? I'm sorry, then you plant that plant in soil, not the water, and you wind up getting a new plant? You just reproduce a plant without sex. That's asexual reproduction. There are cells that you have a cell that looks like this, that they will actually start to pinch in half like this, and then it'll pinch in half more so that by the time you're done, you get 2 new cells. That's asexual reproduction. This is called binary fission. The cell didn't need didn't need a sperm or anything. It just started to pinch in until it divided into 2. So that is a form of asexual reproduction. There's a little organism in the water called a hydra. This is a hydra. It's not the same thing at Dorney Park, but it's a hydra. It attaches to the bottom of freshwater lakes and ponds and slow-moving streams by little suction cups on the bottom. And it has these little tentacles that are on the top. And it actually moves by doing cartwheels. Well, it reproduces, if I can try to do the same, by producing a little bud off to the side. And this bud will actually fall off and go down to the bottom and become a new hydra. That's asexual reproduction. Another characteristic of living things is they maintain a relatively stable internal environment, even when external conditions change dramatically. If you go outside and it is 32 degrees, your body temperature usually stays at about 98.6. That's maintaining a stable internal environment. That's called homeostasis. And that's what living things are able to do. They're able to maintain homeostasis. We could be cold-blooded, we can be warm-blooded, but our temperatures are going to remain the same because of that. Same thing happens with fish that live in water. Instead of them exploding because so much water is going into their bodies, they maintain homeostasis. They maintain stable internal conditions. Living things obtain and use material and energy to grow, develop, and reproduce. So we eat. We eat in order to be able to grow. We eat in order to be able to reproduce. We eat in order to be able to repair our cells. The reactions that happen inside of us that break down the nutrients that we take in are called metabolism. And that metabolism enables our cells to continue the cellular activities using those materials. So if we're thinking about plants, plants are going to use the energy of sunlight, and they're going to make sugars in order for the plants to be able to grow. Where a mice is going to eat grains in order to enable them to grow. Going back to that frog, the tadpole is going to eat tiny little organisms, diatoms, that are floating in the water, and then eventually insects and larvae in order for it to grow and become a frog. All right, we're running out of time. We're almost done with the characteristics of living things. Let me stop here and we'll talk about the next one in the next screencast.